Tonal adjustments is our first category, and this is probably one of the most important one. This deals with the exposure and setting the exposure correctly. So what is a correct exposure first of all, and how can we check? There is a panel which is called histogram, and that's probably the most important panel when you work with tonal values. So once I select that, it will come up here, but it has a couple of options. So let's click on the panel menu and choose expanded view first of all. Then also change the colors to RGB. That way you will see a bit more simplified histogram. You can also refresh the histogram to make sure it's up to date. And now we just have to understand what it means. So the histogram is a representation of all the tonal values, or the amount of each tonal value in the image. From left to right, it goes from the darkest to the brightest details. And the higher each peak is, the more of that tonal value is represented in the image. So in this case, for example, we can see we have quite a lot of dark details. Then we have a little bit less of mid-range tonal values, which we call midtones. And then again, we have a peak here, which means we have quite a lot of bright details as well. But then the peak goes down, and the far right edge is almost empty, which means that we don't have completely white or close to completely white details. So there's a bit of a gap there. The reason I showed this example, because it has a very wide spread of tonal values from very bright to very dark and also mid-range. We can call this a good exposure, but it really depends on what type of look you are after. If you want to reveal all the details in an image, then you can set your exposure similar to this. But you can also go for different looks. For example, in this image, if we check the histogram, we can see that it has more shadows, a little bit of midtones as well, but then hardly any highlights. So the topic that you are taking pictures of will define also how your histogram and generally your tonal values will look like. If I switch to another image again, of course, we have a lot of bright details here on the sky, so we expect to have more highlights, but a bit less shadows. And as I said, we have that gap there on the left, which means that we lack darker details, or closer to the darkest details are missing. So each image will need a slightly different approach, but in this video I'm going to show you the main adjustments that we use to improve that, and also I will talk about one of the filters that I prefer to use to correct the tonal values. So just to clarify what we learned so far about the histogram, here's an example of the same photograph with different settings. The one on the left we would call underexposed, the one on the right we would call overexposed image. They are not really good exposures because you are losing out on a lot of details. It's possible to recover those details, but to a certain extent. Even if you use camera raw files, you will end up introducing noise to those missing details. So on the left side, in the darker parts, we will see noise appearing if we start increasing the brightness, and the same happens on the other side but on the sky and the brighter details like the tower. So when you see something like this histogram where almost everything is on one side, or this one here on the other side, which also has a very high peak on the right side, although it's hardly visible, but it says that it has a lot of burnt out details, or clipped colors we also call them. They are the completely white or completely black in case of this image. So these are not good histograms. If you see something like this and you have a different shot of the same scene, then try to avoid using these. But let's see the tonal adjustments in action. So we have a bad exposure here. If I go to my histogram panel, we can see that we mainly have dark details visible in this image and bright details, but we are missing the midtones, which is the most visible range. So that is why we are not seeing much details either in the foreground or in the background. But luckily, we don't have much clipped colors because the tonal values stop exactly around the edges. So there's no peaks going all the way to the edges, which means we can recover and improve this image. And one of the best features for this would be the shadow highlights adjustment. Unfortunately, that's not available as an adjustment layer, so you have to select it from the image menu. But if you are a CC user, you can use it non-destructively by converting your layer into a smart object and then go to Image Adjustments, Shadow Highlights. Once you select that, it will come up with these default options. Now, you can simplify it a bit if you turn off the Show More options, and that way you can see exactly what's going to happen both on the image and also in the histogram panel. So just to see what happens, when we set it back to the default options, this is how our high contrast but low in detail image looks like in the histogram. Then if I increase shadows, that will selectively brighten the shadows without affecting the highlights. And then also, if I increase the highlights, that will selectively darken my highlights without again affecting the shadows. And you can see before and after within the histogram. So increasing, decreasing shadows will just move the shadows into the middle, and then again increasing the highlights will move all those bright details again closer to the center. Now if I click on Show More options, I can also access an option for highlights called Radius, which is useful because one problem when you do these changes is that you will have a halo around the highest contrast edges. I can see that halo around him, and if I reduce the radius, that halo will be gone completely. So that was with the halo and without it. You can also decide to increase the radius further up. That's another way to reduce that effect, but I'm going to reduce it down like this, and then we can click on OK. So now we can see before and after. Because I have it as a smart filter, I can just turn it off. That was before, and that's after. So both look at the image and the histogram to see the difference we made. It looks so much better already. The only thing I would also use is a bit of levels adjustment after this to compensate for the shadow highlights effect, because shadow highlights tends to lose contrast from the image. So I would go to the levels adjustment layer and then just simply drag the black point up a bit and maybe slightly the white point down as well. So now we can turn it on and off and see that it looks again a little bit better. Now let's switch to another example. Here we have this composition which looks really nice, but I feel like it's lacking something. I mean, if I'm going for this hazy look, then this is perfect. But let's say I want to increase the contrast once again. So I could either go to the histogram first and check what's the problem, or go straight into levels or even curves. Now, let me show you, just to learn something new, how to use the curves adjustment layer for increasing contrast. So if I click on that, normally what we do here is increase the curve to brighten or decrease the curve to darken the overall image. So instead of doing that, what I can do is to drag it down, but keep the point with which we drag the curve down further to the left, which means it will mainly affect the shadows. And then I can click and drag the highlights up, and with that creating an S-curve. This is the S-curve that can be used to increase contrast in images. And depending on the amount of the curve itself, it will be either more intense or less intense. And by the way, the curves adjustment layer also has a black point and a white point, which you can adjust just like in levels. And then only within that range you will be changing the values. So I can still create an S-curve within this range here. So with this extreme contrast effect, we made a huge difference on the image. Let's see before and after. But let's see another example with the curves. In this case, we have an overexposed image, which is not too bad. So we could even use it like this. But maybe I want to tone it down slightly, especially the background, because at the moment it's a little bit too bright. So first thing I could do is to go to curves and then drag the curve down on the overall image, which will make everything darker. But then I could also remove this gap here at the bottom. So we don't need that, and that actually increases the contrast already. Now my only concern is that the girl with the camera got a little bit too dark. In these cases, don't forget to use the mask on the adjustment layer. So by going to the toolbar and selecting the brush tool with a soft edge brush and black as my foreground color, I can paint over her to remove the effect from her. So if I check this now, turn the adjustment layer off, that was before and that's after. You can see the change only affects the background and not the foreground, thanks to this simple masking. And you don't even need to do a selection, just use a big soft edge brush to locally apply the adjustment instead of the overall image. Now in this last example, I would like to show you two things. First of all, whenever you use tonal adjustments like levels and curves, one thing you should bear in mind that whenever you increase the black point and reduce the white point, you are actually losing all those details or color information that was to the right of the white point and to the left of the black point. This is called clipping, and there's even a better way to see this. If you hold down the Alt or Option key while dragging these little arrows, you will see a different view of what is happening. This is almost like a thermal view. And in case of the black point, whatever turns completely black is the worst. So those details are purely black now. There's no detail on them at all. And we can actually see it. Once I let go the Alt, that's exactly what shows there. And if I do the same, holding down Alt or Option while dragging the white point, anything that turns completely white will be again clipped to completely white. You should avoid doing these things. So whenever you do the changes on the black point and white point, try to be careful and subtle with them. What I mean is something like this would already be too much colors being lost. So I would keep it somewhere around here. So wherever the tonal values are still very flat, you can clip into, but don't go into areas where you have too much details. Like these peaks get lost, that means we are losing too much details there. Now there are also two other adjustment layers, brightness, contrast, and exposure, which are also useful, but I wouldn't spend time on them because they are very straightforward how to work with. Instead, in this video, the last example is going to be the camera raw filter, because camera raw offers amazing options for adjusting exposure. And first I will show you directly here within Photoshop, applying it as a filter. So I'm just going to delete my levels adjustment, and instead of using that, I will go to filter and choose camera raw filter. But remember, if you choose convert for smart filters, you can also use it as a smart filter, which means it will be non-destructive. So now I can choose camera raw filter, and then in this dialog box I can even drag these values around within the histogram. So that way I can do exactly what I did before. So adjusting these values by just dragging the histogram itself around. That way it already looks better. But of course you can also do the same thing here with the exposure, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. So these are even more specific than just black point, white point and midtones. Here you have even more control. And normally what I do is reduce the highlights and increase the shadows. That way we get a better result. So let's see before and after by pressing P on the keyboard. So yeah, that definitely looks better after. And apart from using camera raw filter just to adjust the tonal values, you have loads of other options here like clarity, which is one of my favorite ones, with which we can add already so much more contrast. So once again, before and after, you can see it's a big difference. In a separate video, I will come back to camera raw, but there's one thing I would like to explain, that if you don't have the filter available within Photoshop, you can still use it on images by going to the File menu and choose Browse in Bridge. You will be able to select an image, right-click on it and choose Open in Camera Raw. Even if it's a JPEG file like this one or PNG, you can still open it. It doesn't have to be a RAW file. And once it's opened in Camera Raw, then you can just do exactly the same things what we did before. Like in this case again, I would probably reduce the blacks, make them even darker, increase shadows slightly, reduce highlights, and then we could also add other options. But if I just click on done, Bridge will remember these settings. So we can see it has some camera raw adjustments. So if I next time click on this JPEG file within Bridge, it will automatically open in camera raw. And if I then want to take this into Photoshop, all I need to do is to click on Open Image. Once I click on that, it will come up in Photoshop with the changes that I applied in camera raw. And this is all I wanted to show you about tonal adjustments. So in the next video, we will focus on color adjustments.